Well, all right, nostalgia trappers, let's do this. David Parsons here. I hope you are doing well, despite the waters rising all around us, literally and metaphorically. I say that because it seems like every summer I do a nostalgia trap episode, or at least an intro like this, where I'm sitting here talking into a microphone about how summertime vibes are especially apocalyptic. I'm not sure what that's all about, but it's like 120 degrees in the desert right now. Hundreds of people are dead in Texas because of these superstorms that are dropping bombs of water on areas that have never seen anything like that before. And as I'm speaking right now, there are ice agents, dozens of them, maybe hundreds of them, spilled out onto roads in Camarillo, California, the town just next door to where I'm at in Ventura. And I'm watching some of this unfold on social media, where the ICE agents are trying to obviously grab, arrest, and deport farm workers there. And there are protesters there. I suspect many of them are family members of the people that ICE is attacking. And there is tear gas being lobbed. There is a little war going on these local roads. And that just feels like, I don't know, it reminds me of, this is a total 2000s hipster reference, which will make sense when we talk later with my guest today. But it reminds me of this Arcade Fire song, which is called Windowsill, which is from their Neon Bible album. The chorus of that song is, "The tide is high and it's rising still, and I don't want to see it at my windowsill." And I think that's, we're not going to get a choice of whether or not we see it at our windowsill. It comes back to another very, very commonly referenced work of art on this show, the movie Children of Men, which as its primary aesthetic sort of takes the idea that the background is where all of these things are happening, this kind of like disturbing pulse of apocalyptic sort of developments and fascistic developments, honestly, are happening and getting closer and closer, and it certainly feels that way right now. So I'm trying not to freak out. I don't know what to do about any of this, and I wonder if anyone has any idea, really, because there's a part of me that feels like all of this has its own engine, and we just have to ride it out and see it through as those waters just keep on rising. So I'll stop with the poetry, and I'll get to our guest today because I'm really excited to share this conversation. This was a really fun one. I'm talking today with Ethan Lascity. He is someone who's an assistant professor and director of the fashion media program at Southern Methodist University, and the author of a book called The Abercrombie Age, Millennial Aspiration and the Promise of Consumer Culture. This conversation hit a lot of buttons for me because I remember so clearly the kind of pop culture and kind of clothing, fashion, aesthetic moment of the late 90s and early 2000s that he's talking about in this book. So this was a super fun conversation, and I think it's not unconnected to the larger conversation about where we've gone since and how economically, politically, culturally, socially, we have devolved since this moment. And as Ethan points out, maybe the Abercrombie moment was part of that, was sort of a lie when it was happening. So I think that will become clear as you listen to this conversation. I thank you for being a Nostalgia Trap listener. If you want to get more of our podcasts, our bonus episodes, our news trap stuff, we really appreciate the support. We are entirely an indie media operation, and all that means is the only support we get is from our listeners. So check out the link in the episode description to our Patreon page. We give a lot of bonus stuff out to our subscribers. So I thank everyone that is doing that, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. Here is me talking with Ethan Lascity. Ethan Lascity, good to see you. Thank you for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And welcome to Nostalgia Trap. It feels like that this podcast is waiting for your voice in some ways because the nostalgia trap of the late 90s and early 2000s is one we talk a lot about. And I want to say the name of your book before we even begin. It's called The Abercrombie Age: Millennial Aspiration and the Promise of Consumer Culture. And it definitely caught my eye when I was looking through. It's a UNC press, right? University of
It
North
is.
Carolina, right?
Yes.
So, tell me about this book. First, I can just start by saying I just watched the J Lo video "Waiting for Tonight" in anticipation of talking with you because you mentioned it in your book,
Mhm.
and it brought me back to a very specific moment in like pop culture history and the history of MTV specifically, because MTV sort of shaped me so much growing up. But where did you first start thinking about writing a book about this moment?
Yeah. So, I have always been really fascinated with Abercrombie and Fitch, the branding around it, the pop culture of the time. Um, as somebody who came of age right as this was happening, right toward the late 90s, early 2000s, it was just such a cultural touch point for me, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, it really drove my interest in fashion as a field of study. And so this project grew out of my master's thesis. So it's really been percolating for the better part of 15 years or so.
And
Um,
you think a lot about fashion and clothes, right?
yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
By all means.
I would love to unpack why I looked a certain way at certain points in time.
Well, and I mean, I think when at this time period, right, we were just so tuned into lifestyle branding,
Yeah.
and tuned into the messages around it, right? And I mean, my sort of entry point into this book and also just sort of like the field is if you go back to LFO Summer Girls,
Yes.
which references the brand, right? And so that was this such a I don't know, inflection point, right? In how we actually use the brand, how Abercrombie and Fitch worked as an identity marker at that point, right? We literally used it to describe people and high schools and popular things
Yes.
in a way that we haven't, I don't think, since, but I think was really poignant at the time.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I remember about Abercrombie is the shirtless dudes that were sort of hanging out as like live models outside of the store. And I, I wonder, it's hard to sort of remember exactly how I felt about it, but I think part of me always felt sort of bad that I didn't look exactly like them, and that I wasn't like the sort of like clean cut frat boy. And part of me wanted to construct an identity that was against that, in part because I didn't feel welcome in that space, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Right. And I mean, and I think that's the push and pull there, right?
Yeah.
Because, and again, at that time, and I write in the book, I have a very vivid memory of when the first Abercrombie and Fitch store opened within driving distance of where I grew up. And I just happened to be at the mall as people were training, and I stumbled upon all of the people who I assume would go on to be some of the shirtless graders, right? And so have the
Yes.
same sort of feeling that you did, right? That it's like I should look like this, right? This is sort of the ideal, right? But then there's also all of these alternative brands, right, that we could buy into, right? I mean, thinking back to sort of like Hot Topic or Pacific Sunwear or all of these alternative IDs that were constructed in much of the same way, right? But were for people who didn't want to be in the Abercrombie vein.
Yeah, totally. I mean, yeah, Hot Topic was the place for me, I felt like. And yeah, this commodify your dissent, right? I mean,
Exactly.
I want to read a brief paragraph from the introduction to your book because
Sure.
it resonated so deeply with me. And I understand, and I know you do too, because you write about it, that this sort of like talking about generations and generational experiences is an imperfect science in some ways. You're talking about vibes, you're talking about zeitgeist, and yet there are like dominant trends that you can sort of identify and think about. And there's a paragraph that I want to read here that I think a lot of our listeners might resonate with this as well. It says, this book is an examination of messages produced for teens from roughly 1995 through 2008. The films, TV shows, music videos, and fashion brands aimed at my age cohort, the elder millennials, sold a particular aspirational version of the American dream that likely never existed in the first place, but one we undoubtedly cannot meet now. Slightly too young to be considered Generation X, and yet too old to be fully millennial, my cohort lived through the digital revolution as tech gadgets like PCs and cell phones and social media all became mainstays during our formative years and entered adulthood at the end of the golden age of American prosperity. In the words of one writer, we are an unclaimed, misfit micro generation, the poor suckers in the middle, first given a sweet taste of the good life, then kicked in the face. Later age cohorts, including younger millennials, barely experienced American prosperity at all. That's such great writing, and I felt like it put into words a lot of what I've sort of tried to think about in terms of that weird position we're in generationally.
Yeah. I mean, I obviously cannot take credit for the metaphor there of the generation getting kicked in the face, right? But that was just such a great, I think, visualization, right? As somebody, I graduated from college in 2006, so
Hmm.
I entered the workforce pre Great Recession and remember, I was a journalist at the time, and so remember watching all of that happen, right? In sort of slow-mo. And how, that has, led us to now in a lot of, I think, really pronounced sort of ways.
Can we
Yeah.
talk a little bit about the larger sort of like, I don't know, the political and economic stuff you're talking about? Because and we can think about it in terms entirely of pop culture, because I'm a little bit older than you, but I still think of myself as not really fitting into Gen X and not really fitting into millennial. I'm sort of in the middle. But I remember MTV in the 90s as a teenager being very grungy and angsty. And at some point, it's sort of flipping to something else. How much was MTV a part of your experience growing up?
So much, right? I
Yeah.
mean, the entire TRL, Total Request Live over Times Square was so formative for me, right? Just like watching it after school, right? Watching it take hold. And I think you're right in that it was right around that time, right? TRL came out, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, late 97 and like into 98.
Hmm.
And there was this moment, right, that switched from the Nirvana and early grunge sort of 90s, right, into the bubblegum pop, right? The Britney Spears, the NSYNC, the Backstreet Boys, right? That has this sort of change. And I think what was being sold in significant ways.
How did you feel about that at the time? Because I remember I was maybe because I was a little bit older, I remember being so mad at the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC and felt like I hadn't really been radicalized politically. I was still very young, but I remember thinking like, God, this is so shallow, and these boys are such like the pretty boy corporate kind of squeaky clean vision of American life that I don't even think exists. And I really remember hating it. And I remember, ironically, maybe Eminem being a
Mhm.
voice on Total Request Live a lot that was like pushing back against the boy groups. And I
Mhm.
felt like, well, that's my guy, the guy that like experienced, and they're probably on the same label, all that kind of thing.
I
But
mean, you know what? That's when you start digging back into this, right? It's just like it's so cynical in a lot of ways, I feel, right? Because it was created, right, for, the different bands and even watching TRL, you have this idea, who's going to be, number one for the day, right? And it's this competition between the squeaky clean boy bands, right? The pop princesses, the M&Ms, the, Limp Bizkits and Corn and the Offspring, right? And you have this sort of like alternative, right? But it's all in the same show. It's all marketed through MTV. It's all put together in the same way.
hmm
I think is really it's fascinating to look back at, right? Because as I grew up, I didn't have, I remember first hearing NSYNC, and so I was very much of a boy band fan, I guess. That's
Hmm.
probably too strong of a word for me, but I didn't have particular allegiance to Pearl Jam, Nirvana,
Right, right.
right? I remember I was in sixth grade when NSYNC came out. So, I didn't have that juxtaposition, I guess, to gauge, right? But so now looking back at it and seeing, how again it's all in different packages, right? But somewhat of the same stuff, I think is
It's
really,
it's kind of incredible how white all of it is too, and how
yes.
white and straight all of it is.
Yeah.
Like as much as there were, these kind of like there was a vision of a counterculture, it was still like really narrow in terms of like the types of people. Everyone was really pretty. Like
Mhm.
everybody, even the like bad boys and bad girls were all like skinny, white, and pretty generally. I mean,
Yeah.
did TRL that didn't really even get into hip hop that much at all, it seems like.
I mean, there was some, right? Like Brandy and Monica were on the countdown, and you
Yeah,
had
uh-huh.
different, particularly Black female artists, right? Destiny's Child,
That's
Beyonce,
right. Yep.
that sort of trend, TLC. But you're right in that, and particularly, the people of color who are put into the white popular culture, right, are
Hmm.
again very vanilla. I don't, that's not the right,
Right.
that's not the right term, right? But it is this very particular assimilation that's being pitched, I think, for most of it.
Oh God, it's such a weird, weird moment. And I mean, can you talk a little bit about the sort of vision of prosperity that you describe in here? Because it feels like um, a movie like Clueless that you mention a lot in your book is emblematic of a certain kind of expectation
Mhm.
that of what life would be like.
Yeah. I mean, and when you go back and you watch Clueless, right? And there's still within different fashion podcasts and they refer to the Cher's fashion closet in Clueless, right?
Mm,
The sort of computerized software, right? That's going to teach you how to dress, right? Or pick out her outfits,
that's right. Yeah.
right? And it's this very sort of fanciful thing, although people are still trying to reproduce it in 2025, right? Which is, I think the allure of what we could be, right? And in some cases, right, the selling prospect of this is what we should be, right?
Mm,
We could
hmm.
buy into this, right? With enough money, we could be Cher, right, from Clueless, or we could be the Freddie Prinze Jr. and She's All That, or take your pick of idyllic characters, right? But again, with the particular consumption patterns vis-a-vis with enough money, right? And the right knowledge, we can get there, is I think the sort of what so much of this was telling us.
And shopping at the mall at like brick and mortar stores. That seems like another change too. Is that this is as much as Cher's wardrobe is computerized, she's still like going to malls and going to like places, and it seems like not only do people not have money for that anymore, like that world doesn't really exist in quite the same way, and certainly for a much narrower set of people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's such an interesting dynamic. And, speaking of brick and mortar retail, so I grew up in the Northeast. I live in Dallas, Texas right now.
Hmm.
And in Dallas, we still have massive shopping malls that get packed on weekends.
Yeah, certain
You know,
areas definitely do. Yeah.
and I mean, and it's a higher end store that we're looking at, right? It's a higher end clientele. It's not necessarily the run of the mill, if you will. But
Yeah,
I mean, it's
right.
still really prominent in some cases. But I think you're right in that there was this shift, right? And I think we're sort of in a little bit of a pivot point again, where some of the, my younger students now are like going back to the mall in some cases.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I was just in New Jersey a couple months ago, in suburban New Jersey, and the mall seemed as busy and insane as ever. Whereas I live in a suburb in Southern California where our mall is just sort of like dead. There's just very little going on there. So I think,
Yeah.
yeah, you're right. It changes, depending on where you are. But in terms of just the overall idea of like shopping as a central sort of activity doesn't
Mhm.
seem quite as much as it was.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I mean, and in some cases, right? younger people, I guess sort of ourselves as well, right? But people younger than us are shopping all the time, right?
Yeah.
Whenever you're on social media, ads are coming up, right? Whenever you're online, you have access to this in this, really pronounced sort of way.
It's an online mall. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's sort of an algorithm that's controlling that more than maybe MTV or what I mean, one of the things you mentioned in your book is that sort of like idea of a monoculture. And people talk about that a lot. Like we lost the monoculture and it fractured, but it seems like it wasn't really there in the 90s and 2000s either, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, the whole idea of a monoculture, I think, is always a little problematic, right? Because it's who are we, who gets to tell the story, right? And who
Yes.
in power are able to shape that, right? So, you know, I think this was the last sort of semblance in some cases, right, of a monoculture, right? That whether or not you wanted to be an Abercrombie and Fitch teen, right, you had some sort of relationship to it, right? Whether it was
Mm.
like an active dislike, right? Whether it was sort of a rebellion or whether it was something that you were trying to aspire to, right? It was something that was sort of central, right? And I mean, there are certainly subcultures therein, in ways that I don't know if we have now, right? And so one of the things I actually struggled with when writing the book is like, are things different, or am I
Mhm.
just right?
I
Like,
think that's a very common question for people as they get older. How much did things really change? Yeah.
yeah, right. And I mean, so much of this I do obviously bounce ideas off my students and I'm in class, and I'm like, hey, who's doing this, or and I do think that there is a difference in the way that we do retailing and we do shopping and this sort of stuff. But yeah, I mean, to your point, I think that there was always the monoculture is always contested, right? And so any use of
Well, I still love talking about this stuff. I still love, even if I am making overgeneralizations, and I think that one of the generalizations that came out when I was reading your book is this idea of a kind of optimism. It seems like that's lost, an optimism about the future, and it's sort of weird to say because you know, as much as there was this sort of like millennial pop culture that was very shallow and shopping driven. Like you say, there was also sort of a reaction there as well. Like I think a lot about movies like Fight Club and The Matrix. They came out, I think, both in like 98, 99, that were really attacking the whole consumer driven corporate life. All that stuff seems sort of, I don't know. It seems ironic now in some ways because so many people would want the stability of the corporate jobs that those characters are hating so much in the late
yeah.
90s. But it feels like there was a sort of assumption that jobs were available, that you were just gonna like end up like getting a boring job and having a nice house and like having and just shopping the rest of your life. And that was the emptiness of the future. And it seems like the vision of the future that younger people have now is very different than that.
It is, I mean, vastly different. I
Hmm.
will never forget. So again, I've bounced around at a couple different schools, and in my first class at my current university, basically one of my students was like, "Well, there's nothing to look forward to, right? We're in the middle of a climate disaster, and the world's going to burn, and here we are." And
Yeah.
you know, I mean, a gut punch, right? As the instructor in that room, but also, I mean, that's just so different than the world I grew up in, right? Even, when I went to college, right, and looking for a future and looking to, you know, get out into the world and do things. And, and I don't want to say that, her view is predominant, although I think it largely is
I
among,
hear it a lot. Yeah.
you
And I
know,
think it's common in social media, like memes and things like that. Yeah, of course.
yeah. And, and I mean, there's just something that's so, and sad about that in some cases.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
and
it, but it's sad, but at the same time, I'm thinking about your book and you sort of like thinking about that how sort of fake the optimism was in the 2000s, right? Like when you think about even like J-Lo's video, Waiting for Tonight, there's something so and again, I understand it's just pop music and it's fun and like I can be seen as the just the curmudgeon that's like looking at this from the teenage sort of angsty point of view. But like watching that video, I was like, God, what is this about? It's just like dancing in a club with like some laser lights, and the year
Dancing in the
2000 is
jungle.
happening. What's that?
They were dancing in the jungle.
That's
It wasn't
right.
a club. They were like in the middle of like the Amazon, right? Like it was particular, but sorry.
The club is the rainforest.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right? I mean, who doesn't want that? But yeah, I mean, I think you're right in that there is a I hesitate to say superficial,
Yeah.
mostly because I think we have really negative connotations around that. And
Yes.
as somebody who studies fashion, I don't think superficial is even a bad thing in a lot of ways, right? I think that there's some, obviously
Yeah,
aesthetics
I'm
and
with you. I'm
stuff.
with you with that. I think that's
Um,
important, an important point.
but there are, to your point, I mean, it is, there was this fakeness, right? That I
Mm,
don't think we could necessarily see through at the time, right?
mm,
Um, or at least I think, somebody of my age growing into that, right?
yeah. Yeah.
It felt very real.
I'm thinking about like sort of I a lot of people would accuse me of hipsterism, especially my fashion choices over the years, and like where that position is in relation to this sort of quote unquote dominant pop culture, because ironically, obviously, hipster culture is mainstream culture in a lot of ways too.
Yeah.
But I lived in Brooklyn during the height of like the lumberjack years where like every dude had the beards and the
Right.
plaid shirts and the big glasses. And I'm trying to, I mean, you're a fashion guy, so tell me what did it, what was all that about? And like, how does the hipster relate in here? Because I'll throw one more thing in here for you to react to as well. Because like when I was younger, I didn't have the money to shop at the mall, and like I think part of me was resentful of that. I ended up shopping at thrift stores, which was like a kind of cool thing to do in the 90s, and
Mhm.
being like a thrift store grungy guy and eventually ironic t-shirt guy was
Yeah.
sort of a way of saving money on clothes
Mhm.
while projecting some sort of identity that said like fuck the whole like mainstream culture that shops at Abercrombie, if that makes sense,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's a little bit of a give and take here, right? Because I think in the era that you're thinking of in Brooklyn, right?
Yes.
The what 2010s ish,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Uh-huh.
There was this particular, ethos and this particular aesthetic that really took over, right? I mean, if you think of the Mumford and Sons sort of, right?
Yes, totally.
You know, um,
Fleet foxes.
yeah.
We could go on and on.
Yeah. And you know what I mean? And I think while initially that was sort of counterculture, right? It became real when I lived in New York, that was the dominant culture, at least as I saw it,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
What was to align yourself with, right?
Well, it was kind of like where all the young bourgeoisie was. I feel like a lot of those people were like what we might call tech bros now. Like a lot of I was in grad school, so it was a lot of like humanities grad students. But it was like
Okay.
a lot of the people that I was associating with were like worked at Google and
Okay.
like were sort of like in that first generation of like the tech thing. Back when tech actually had a lot more of a positive, optimistic charge to it than it does now.
Yeah, yeah. Oftentimes when I've taught fashion history courses or topics, I refer to sort of the hipster aesthetic as, play acting poor. But
Totally. Yeah.
I was pulling that. I didn't want to call you that, but
No, I'm not offended
yeah.
by it at all. I mean, it's sort of like the Carhartt thing too, right? Like wearing, like kind of wearing this sort of like working class sort of costume. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so, yeah, so prominent. I mean, and I think we want to be, to
There's
be
such a psychology going on there, I swear. Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, again, to be generous, right? I think that there's a valorization, right, of a simpler time, let's say, right?
Yeah.
Um, I think we might be able to trace, directly from the sort of mason jars of that time period into, what Fixer Upper and Trad Wives now, but that's
Yeah. I just was
conversation.
at a restaurant the other day and they served us mason jars, and I was like, wow, this is kind of a throwback.
Right. Amazing.
I love your point about superficiality and the sort of like easy derogatory charge that can have for us to say like, oh, it's so shallow or they're just into fashion. Because, you're a person who studies fashion and takes it seriously. So how would you sort of put that for us? Like, how would you defend the idea of fashion as an important part of who we are, even if many people might see it as sort of a shallow exercise.
Yeah. What what I always tell students when I like start off classes and talk about this, right, is that, we're always told not to judge a book by its cover, right? We shouldn't judge people by what they're wearing, by what they look like. We fucking do it, right? Like it is something,
Yes,
and it's
yes.
not malicious, right? For the most part. I mean, certainly it can be malicious, but it's somewhat, I'm a communication guy, is my background academically. And so it's something we just non-verbally pick up immediately, right? And I think that by dismissing it as superficial, right, by saying it's something that we shouldn't pay attention to, I think we miss a lot of the important things that get picked up on, right?
Mm,
And I
hmm.
think we do everybody a disservice by saying that this isn't something we should worry about, right? That this is something frivolous or whatever, um, because it does impact us, right? Whether we like it or not. And I'm not necessarily, again, valorizing that, but I do think, the way that we're expected to dress when we show up for a job interview, right? Or the way that we dress if we're going out to a bar to find mates, right? To
Yeah,
hook up with
right.
somebody. Like there's all it comes back to what we look like, and it comes back to the clothing that we're wearing, and it comes back to the identity we construct for ourselves, right? Whether that is, buying into the Abercrombie and Fitch dominant sort of ethos, whether that is thrift shopping, right? And finding your identity in this hodgepodge rebellion sort of aspect, right? Um, I think, taking all of that into account is important. Um, and I just, I think taking that seriously, allows us the opportunity to think more critically about it.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you said that. And honestly, I moved to New York in my early 20s, and I sort of had an attitude of like, I don't engage in any of that fashion stuff. I'm norm core. I sort of wear, and I have no identity. But even that is an identity. I mean, even that is a choice. But God, being on the subway with people every day, going into Manhattan and going into Brooklyn and just like sort of seeing the fashion show that was, and then being a professor, honestly, and being in front, thinking about how I was presenting myself to students was huge in sort of making me think more seriously about exactly what you're saying, which is like, what am I communicating? And also, yeah, as much as we like, I think liberals especially like to say like, oh, we all should just like appreciate each other for who we really are. We all do it. We all make judgments, and it's hard not to be catty about what people are wearing. And if you don't like somebody, you're gonna start with like what they looked like. It just seems natural.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
again, right? I'm in some cases we're just looking for the people who are like us, right?
Yeah.
We're gonna because it does connote all of these other aspects, right? So, if you're wearing, the flannel button down and skinny jeans and, hat, the assumption was in 2014, you're listening to Mumford and Sons, right? And you have this
Yeah.
sort of ethos,
Totally.
versus the sort of 90s, whether, you know,
I love
the,
that the connection is music,
so,
right? Like
yeah.
it's like immediately like I know what kind of music you I remember there was an Onion headline that was like in the late 90s or early 2000s that was like something like 14 Yola Tango or 14 record store clerks killed in Yola Tango concert fire, and it had pictures of all of them looking exactly the same with like chunky glasses and all that kind of stuff. And I looked at that and I was like, that's sort of me. They're like making fun of me. And how do they know that I listen to Yola Tango? But I wonder how much this is a product of a certain kind of era where pop culture and music is attached so directly to the way you look.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do, right? And, I think that it is something, right? The
Yeah.
sort of, intertextual nature of this.
Mm.
And again, right, this is the element of being old, right? Is that happening now? I would sort of venture to guess that it probably still is, just maybe in ways that I'm not familiar with.
Yeah, like I don't know how to judge people as much anymore. Is that something that like you lose that radar as you get older? But maybe it's partly is like my students, I don't know what music they're listening to. And when I ask students often to be like, write about your favorite song or album that you're into right now, it's often like just like a Spotify playlist thing, like it like a lo-fi beats to study to. It's not necessarily so I don't know. So I had such a particular set of bands that I would have like told you this is who I am
Mm.
at a certain age. I don't think I would be that way as much anymore, but I would certainly narrate my personal history in terms of the bands and artists I was listening to. I'm not sure if that works exactly the same way, but I remember, like if you look at an Abercrombie guy, you would make a judgment about what kind of music they listen
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
to.
Yeah, I don't know. And part of this is, I think, media fragmentation, right? So the
Yeah.
Spotify playlist, right, are making this just so much more diffuse, right? I will say all of my students still listen to Taylor Swift, right?
Yeah.
The sort
Yeah.
of archetype in some ways.
But what does someone who listens to Taylor Swift look like? Like what do they dress like? Where do they shop? Like that seems like it's not knowable in the same
Yeah.
way.
I mean, there are some elements there. I
Yeah.
don't put my students on blast. My students are a very particular subset of college students.
Yeah.
But I mean, there are elements from Taylor Swift, the sort of the friendship bracelets, right? That sort of get passed,
Mm.
right? And so there are some elements there. I think you're right in that not nearly to the same extent, and not nearly as I guess.
Immediately identifiable
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was
as
gonna say.
like the goth girl,
Yeah.
like you just knew the goth person. You knew the Avril Lavigne skater girl. Like it's sort of like maybe it was just like the costumes were much more pronounced. It's partly, I think about this with cars too. Like every car is like, I saw someone describe every car as looking like a gray cough drop. Like every car just looks like is gray. I mean, it's almost like a monochrome of gray cars out there. And it just seems like maybe there's less of a desire to take on like that pronounced an identity among younger people. I could be wrong about that. I'm just totally speculating.
Well, so actually, speaking of cars, it's a bit ago, and I don't remember where I saw it, but floating around the interwebs, there was a study of car colors, right, and how everything is defaulting to neutral in
Yeah.
ways that wasn't, you know, 30 years ago now.
Yeah.
But I think, we see a lot of this sort of flexibility in other fashion brands and in other sort of branding aspects right now as well. So I mean, if you have you been in a Uniqlo?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
And so, the white walls, wood floors are so nondescript, right? In
Yes.
comparison to what Abercrombie and Fitch was, or Hollister, or insert Hot Topic, right? Any of these sort of brands of the 90s and early 2000s, which were highly thematic, right? And so now we're sort of going away from that. And instead we're having this more neutral, right? We don't want to show this off, right? We don't want this to be identifiable in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Or flamboyant or maximalist. It feels like God, now that you say that, I'm like thinking about like coffee shops because I wrote a book about coffee houses and like I think a lot about sort of like how they've changed over the years and even like in Reality Bites, right? In Reality Bites, which is a very Gen X movie, there's like this coffee house that's like the hipster coffee house of that era. And it's
Mhm.
really earthy and hippie and warm and like just lots of stuff on the walls and lots of rugs. And now the coffee shops that I would identify as the hipster coffee shops in my town and in Brooklyn, etc., are very minimalist. They're like black and white, clean, nothing on the walls, just almost like if anything that's like a desert aesthetic. There's just nothing going on in them, and I wonder what that really means. I know it's like you can't really nail it down, but there's
It,
something going on with the blandness
yeah.
of our culture. Yeah.
So in one of my classes, we just read Filter World by Kyle Chayka. He's a New Yorker reporter. And he argues in that particularly about coffee shops, that
Mm.
it is part of the algorithmic culture that we're under. And so when people start looking for Yelp reviews or start looking for coffee shops, there's a particular aesthetic that got imported around the world.
Wow.
So, I mean, I don't know if I 100% buy the argument. My students were very, very much against this whole sort of thing. But, I mean, there is definitely something, just remembering, I mean, even a Starbucks, right? Even 2012, right?
Yeah.
2010, were very much, I don't know, more unique, right?
It's
Versus,
weird. It's almost like, and again, I'm totally speculating here, but there is something about online culture that has bred a fear of being cringe. Like don't go out on a limb because you might be cringe. And so like the best thing to be would sort of like to blend into the background. There's a kind of weird conformity going on there that seems like it is very different than the like hypercolor individual sort of stuff that we were sold in the 90s and 2000s, if that makes sense.
yeah, no, absolutely, right? And obviously in some cases, right, one of the things about Abercrombie and Fitch is that, right, we were sold a particular identity just like all of the other people sold that identity, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I do think there's a whitewashing of it, right? That we're sort of not having any sort of, or our, students, the younger generations, right, aren't taking those risks, right, and trying that out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes me feel bad for them in some ways. In part, I mean, they're in a shitty economic moment. I definitely feel all of that no future climate stuff. I felt a little bit of that when I was younger, but I also really, your book made me think a lot about how left out I felt from the kind of prosperity that was being experienced by the people on TV and in movies. Because I remember feel it was kind of a shock to come out of college. I went to UC Santa Barbara, which is a big 4-year college. A lot of people with money went there. And I remember realizing, I think it was the first time that I realized my class position, like next to the other students who were driving BMWs and things like that. And I was like, I had an 84 Toyota Corolla in college. And I was sort of like in this like, wow, I'm sort of supposed to be this middle class person, but I don't feel like I'm quite there. And that middle, that's why I read that paragraph. That sort of like middle position is a tough one to be in because it does feel like you're almost to this point where you're supposed to be, but you just don't know what you've done to like not get there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, and I, had a lot of similar feelings, I think, right? As somebody who came from a working class background, to see that, right, and to understand that. I think when I really sort of grasped it was when I moved to New York, more or less for grad school, but not
Hmm.
totally, right? And looking around at everyone else, right, and seeing like how do you get there, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And I mean, obviously, again, it was a different time for social mobility. And I think, looking at things now, it seems like it got worse. Um,
yeah. I think
I
so.
don't know. I try to be a little bit within the book conscious of that, right? Because I'm really doing a textual media analysis of what was being sold to us, right? I'm not
Right.
a not an economist or somebody who's going to be able to give you the nuts and bolts and the math behind this. So, which is
Yeah, well, I mean that's how the fashion part of it and the sort of pop culture part of it is how we experience it in a lot of ways, right? And I think that disconnect is really tricky because no one is an economist. Like most people don't have a very sophisticated understanding of what has gone on politically, economically in this country as we're seeing the results of that. But that's what I think your book is partly touching on. Is sort of like this vision that you see in pop culture, especially condensed in this moment in the 90s and early 2000s, that's so at odds with what life is really like for most people.
yeah, absolutely.
Can we talk a little bit before we go here about fast fashion? Because it's something that comes up a lot in my classes. My students seem I was teaching these public speaking classes where students had to take on a particular political or social position. And God, it turned out often insane with the types of things that students want to talk about. Very illuminating, honestly.
Mhm.
And one of their big concerns for young people was fast fashion as not just um, the sort of elements of the aesthetic elements of fast fashion, Old Navy, H&M, and that sort of stuff, but like the sort of social and political and economic costs of it and environmental costs of it.
Yeah.
Which is for me, fast fashion was a new thing. I'm sure it was for you too, where I could actually afford to shop at H&M and Old Navy and buy jeans because I never really shopped at Abercrombie, not only because I didn't look like those guys, but because I probably didn't feel like I could afford it. But there was a sort of I don't know a sort of irony in fast fashion in how accessible it made that world that of middle class consumption to people. At the same time, it came with like a sort of ugly aftershocks, right?
Yeah, no, I mean it's terrible, and I feel you on the Abercrombie. I never purchased anything from Abercrombie and Fitch. I bought one pair of Abercrombie and Fitch jeans from I think Marshalls, right? So
That's
to
funny. They
give you
sell, yeah, they
perspective,
sell them at
right?
places like that. Yeah.
Um, that said, right, fast fashion, and I mean, and just where we are with the fashion system right now is so problematic in so many ways, right? That, I'm sure you've heard from your students, right? But fashion is one of the most polluting industries in the world, right? It,
Mm,
it ranks up there with like crude production,
yeah.
uh, because of how much stuff that we're cycling through. And, and something like an H&M, a Zara, even though that's a little bit more expensive, we have it is this double-edged sword, right? Because it opens up the ability to participate in the fashion system in a different way, right? We don't have to go to the thrift stores, right? We can buy something that's cheap. But in a lot of these cases, they're also just really poor quality,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it falls apart. I mean, Old
Yeah,
Navy pants don't last. None of it lasts. And there's
exactly.
sort of like this also a lot of that tech stuff that seems like it's like filled with microplastics.
Yeah.
I'm
Right.
not
Something
sure
that's
if I should
probably in
even
there
wear
that's
it. Yeah.
never going to dissolve, right? So yeah, and I mean, and also the, labor costs of it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the sweatshops and, something, especially now, as we've moved on to get even faster fashion, right? Than the H&Ms and the Zaras and the Forever 21s, RIP, right? Like, the Sheins, right? That is coming
Oh
from,
God, yeah. Uh-huh.
even honestly Uniqlo, and this is, a brand that I frequently shop at, it wasn't all that long ago, and I may not have all the details on this, but one of the uh shipment ships were confiscated for coming from forced labor camps in China, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
I mean, and so, what we do for that and how we've degraded the whole idea of manufacturing, right? In so many
Hmm.
ways, especially as it regards to clothes. Primarily, also, but this comes back to the superficial aspect, right? If we say that it's unimportant, who cares where it comes from?
Yeah. No, that's great. I like that. And yeah, there's a store in my town that's kind of a boutique called Iron and Resin that is really playing on the like a kind of like masculine motorcycle hipster kind of vision, but very LA and very expensive. But they're also like kind of playing on this thing of like you don't want fast fashion, you want a pair of jeans that's going to last a long time and it's $300, right? And it's sort of like, okay, there are so many contradictions here in terms of what we think of as uh, what we want, not only from an aesthetic point of view, but what we want in terms of how things are produced.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean,
Mhm.
to think about, a $300 pair of jeans is such an investment, right?
Yeah, I
Like,
don't know if they're going to fit in 6 months. You know what I mean?
exactly.
Like,
Yeah. I mean, and it's such a problem, right? To really think about that. Um, and I mean, I don't know, there's no, I think, good solutions for it, you
yeah.
know.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
mean, it's a negotiation always, it seems like. Yeah.
yeah. And I mean, there's certainly some other, right? I'm thinking of a brand like American Giant, right? Which is cheaper than $300 jeans. I think they're like $200 jeans, right?
Okay,
But
fair enough.
yeah, meant to last. But again, right? Not everybody can afford that.
No.
Right?
No. And the reality is too, and I know that there are a lot of people would be like, well, we used to have a time where, people's identities were not formed by having like a million different outfits to wear and be this interchangeable person with a million different pairs of pants. You had one pair of pants and that lasted you your whole life. And it's like, do people really want to go back to that? and part of me feels like there's no going back. Like the culture that you describe, this sort of late 90s, early 2000s moment didn't give birth to this, but it certainly accelerated the notion that your identity is sort of bound up by what you look like and the sort of interchangeability of your clothes and your ability to have lots of different things to wear. And it seems cruel to say, well, now you got to wear one pair of pants, so that we can all save. It almost seems not only cruel, but seems impossible in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly what it is, right? I mean, we're not going back to, the 1950s, right? When people were at home sewing and making their own clothes,
Right.
right? That's
Right.
not going to happen. We don't have the time for that, right? To start with, right? Or the knowledge for it. I mean, I guess the one thing I would point out is that, clothing has always been an identity marker, right? I
Yes.
I think the 90s and the Abercrombie sort of age that I'm talking about there is particular because it has this sort of takeoff of moving beyond the material, right? It was so much about the experience and it's so much about the advertisements and the A&F Quarterly that advertise this whole lifestyle, right? In a
Yes.
way that, you know, things were more material.
Mm.
Uh, really, they're depending on who you read, right? Sort of Polo, Ralph Lauren is sort of the starting point of lifestyle branding. And we
Yeah.
have a
Yeah.
sort of bifurcation where, it's no longer about the garment, it's no longer about the style of clothing or how it's cut or put together, right? It's now about the advertisement. And we have this sort of with that I think really it hits the peak in the late 90s, into the 2000s.
Yeah, just you saying Ralph Lauren and Polo, I have just a sort of like vision in my mind of the catalog pages, but also the like actual space of the stores. I don't know if you've been in a Ralph Lauren store, but they're a little more like maximalist. They're a little more warm. It feels like everything's still expensive in there. Like things are, it doesn't feel like fast fashion at all. But yeah, the sort of like I remember, people, I'm a Calvin and Klein, I'm a Calvin Klein guy, that's sort of like denotes a certain type of person. I wonder, what happened to Abercrombie? They're not what they used to be, right? I
They,
remember, weren't there scandals with racist T-shirts at some point?
uh, that yeah, well, I mean that happened peak Abercrombie in the 90s.
Yeah,
Believe if I'm recalling correctly, it was like 2002 that they had yes, very anti-Asian t-shirts,
yeah, that's right.
you
I do
know.
remember that.
And I mean, they sort of what Abercrombie and Fitch did is I mean, it sort of petered off toward the late 2000s. Ultimately, for a while, they were able to sustain itself from a business standpoint by expanding overseas. Come the end of 2014, the CEO, who had been in charge from 92 through that time, was basically fired from the company
Mm.
because he couldn't turn around the profits. In the years since, it's now come out he was recently charged with sex trafficking,
Yeah, that's right. I
right?
saw some of this. Yep.
So I mean, looking back at it, to think about, you know, what it meant to have shirtless greeters and then somebody who was like, kind of sex trafficking some of the,
Disturbing. Yeah.
right? Like, so very problematic in that end. Abercrombie as a brand is in this really interesting, renaissance in some cases. They brought in a new CEO, they revamped it. At one point they had a massive flagship on Fifth Avenue in New York, shut that down, moved it up the block a little bit. It's more minimalist. It's a little bit not anywhere near as symbolically meaningful, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
it's not
Mm-hmm.
back to the loud music and strong sense and everything. But it's been seeing a lot of growth,
Yeah.
and leaning into a little bit more of a mature demo. It's not necessarily for teens anymore. It's probably like young to mid 20s, or even,
People
early.
that might be able to afford it a little bit more.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
has been fascinating to watch the big pants of the 90s come back and like this sort of like
Love them.
90s aesthetic, right? Yeah, I know. It's sort of perfect for my age, honestly, because I'm done with wearing really skinny jeans. It just
Yeah.
seems very, when I moved to California, they just didn't seem like right anymore somehow. It made sense on the subway, but they don't make sense anymore.
I've always hated skinny jeans, so I've been waiting for these to come back. And I will tell you that I bought 3 pair from the Gap in the exact same style
That's
because
so
they were
funny.
nice and baggy. And I was like, hey, like, let's go.
Yeah, yeah. I'll do the carpenter jeans with the loop on the side. I'll wear the cargo pants. Like let me dress like a 1990s like skater kid because that's like the most comfortable vision. And it feels like a lot of maybe that's pandemic too, because it feels like post-pandemic comfort became a big thing. And I
Yeah,
know we
yeah,
could talk about like athleisure wear, everyone
absolutely.
in sweatpants.
Yeah.
God, I love talking about this stuff. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Well, okay, folks, I think that's going to do it for Nostalgia Trap today. I want to thank Ethan Lascity for a super fun conversation. Go check out his book. It's called The Abercrombie Age, Millennial Aspiration and the Promise of Consumer Culture, out now from the University of North Carolina Press. This was a very specific moment in not only American culture, but in my life. And I didn't really understand it as I was living through it. And Ethan gave me a real context for sort of figuring out why I felt so alienated from the Abercrombie moment. So thank you, Ethan. Thank you for being a Nostalgia Trap listener. And thanks especially to everyone who supports the show on our Patreon page. I couldn't do it without you. If you want to become part of the club, we appreciate it. The link is in the episode description. We'll see you again very soon. Talk to you later. See ya.